So one of the most common questions that I get here on YouTube come from people who think that I'm a complete idiot. They say things like, when a 3.5 thinks a new racket will make his game better, or rackets don't matter, or stop wasting your time with rackets and fix your technique. Now obviously I don't think that I'm an idiot, and I think that rackets do matter. So who's the real idiot here? Well, typically the argument which states that rackets don't matter hinges upon the fact that pros rarely change their rackets. And if they do, it's often due to sponsorship involvement, like when Stan left Head for Yonex or when Iga left Prince for Technofiber. Essentially, the idea is the less time you spend fussing around with new rackets, the less time you spend adjusting to those new rackets, and the more time you can spend on court focusing on drills, making meaningful changes to your game to actually get better at tennis. However, there are some cases where pros made racket changes that they just didn't need to. The most famous instance came when Federer dropped his 90 square inch Wilson for the new RF97, and more recently we had Djokovic update his racket setup in 2018. Given that neither guy changed their setup for extra sponsorship money, I think it's pretty safe to say that rackets do matter on some level. The challenging part is knowing when the right time is to change your racket. Let's start with Federer, who began his professional career using an 85 square inch racket. This is because he turned pro in 1998, a time when court speeds were faster, balls were lighter, and the dominant style on tour was serve and volley, best exemplified by the 1998 year-end world #1 pistol Pete Sampras. A few years later, Fed would go on to switch to a 90 square inch racket that he would become famous for, most notably the K-Factor 6-1 Tour 90. As we all know, he played lights out tennis with that racket, was basically unbeatable for 3 straight years, until some left-handed guy decided he would just relentlessly moonball to Fed's backhand, causing Federer to break down into tears in front of thousands of people.
Maybe I'll try later again. I don't know. God, it's killing me.
The entirety of the ESPN's commentary booth whined about how old Raj needed a new racket years before Fed would drop by Tennis Warehouse, use my affiliate link, and buy himself a brand new RF97. That new racket breathed life into Federer's rusty old game, transforming him into Djokovic's main rival through 2014 and 2015. And then of course we can't forget that Neo backhand, which helped Fed turn the tables on Rafa late in both of their careers. This example represents a drastic change in equipment in response to equally drastic changes, both in men's tennis and with Roger himself. To put it boldly, Old Man Fed just needed a more forgiving racket to keep up with the faster, stronger players who made tennis a much more physically demanding game than the one it was only 10 years earlier when Federer was the apex predator of the ATP. Djokovic, on the other hand, made a much more subtle change. Essentially, he kept the same racket, but he lightened it a little bit, extended it by 1/10 of an inch for a little more power, and moved to an 18x19 string pattern for a little extra spin compared to his super dense 18x20. Roman Proksch, the man behind this change, his big customizer, said this was mostly for Djokovic's cross-court forehand, and his old racket, expertly tailored in 2009, had become too heavy and too slow for the faster, stronger, and more powerful players that were hurting Djokovic on court 10 years later in 2018. Now here, there are two things that both Federer and Djokovic's racket switches had in common. One, they came at low points in their careers, and two, they were designed to make tennis easier for the players. Obviously, it makes sense for pros to make changes in their setups when they're losing. There's often little sense in changing up your racket when you've already found a winning formula. For the other point about making tennis easier for the players, this made sense for Federer and Djokovic because it wasn't like, they were ahead in the point, they were beating their opponent only to choke away their chance to win or spray an approach up or something like that. They were just losing because their opponents were hurting them pace, depth, and power. So for us rec players, those last 2 points just might not be that relatable. This is mainly because as rec players, we beat ourselves way more often than we get beat. From a technical perspective, it's so obvious that we could have won the match with better footwork, safer margins. Whereas Novak and Fed, they're like technically perfect. So how do you know when it's time for a change? Well, I think there are a few key scenarios where a racket change can be beneficial. The first scenario is when your game has plateaued. If you're rapidly improving or rapidly getting worse, it's usually best to focus on yourself. Changing rackets now could disrupt your improvement, and changing on a downward spiral could distract you from the actual problem with your tennis. And for us recreational players, it's very common for us to find that plateau. And I wouldn't say it's for lack of talent. In most cases, I would say it's for lack of time. Most of us have jobs, families, or other hobbies that mean we can only dedicate a certain amount of time per week to tennis. Often, this is only enough to maintain our current level, which is some combination of footwork, anticipation, cardio, and stroke production. But for those players who have plateaued, finding an extra 1 or 2% improvement from a racket switch might be the only improvement they can find that year. Another scenario where you could definitely justify a new racket is if you've improved rapidly and then you've hit this wall of improvement, because it's like the players you're playing against now feel way better, they're hitting too hard, they're pushing you back. In most cases, this means your old racket was a little too light. Maybe it was a beginner, intermediate racket, and you need something a little heavier to keep up with those heavy balls. It's simple physics. If someone hits a hard shot at you, having a heavier racket will help you hit that hard shot back. You'll get more stability and more controllable, more natural power. Now, the last scenario where a new racket might make sense for you is the same scenario that Roger and Novak faced. It's to help combat aging. Going with something lighter and more powerful can really help compensate for slower swing speeds and slower foot speeds you might experience as you get older as a player. You might be thinking that I'm talking about older players, seniors, 60, 65, 70, but it can happen a lot earlier than you think as the result of the modern day slavery that we call working a 9-to-5 job. Spending 40 hours a week sitting in front of your computer, typing away, maybe another hour a day, maybe more commuting, then 2 to 3 hours in front of your TV to unwind. All that sitting is just gonna slow you down. If you're anything like me, when you started your first full-time desk job, you gained some weight, you increased your back pain, and you just started to feel sluggish mentally. So if you're looking to improve your game with a racket switch, you might want to start with my consultation service, where I can do some one-on-one time with you to find the best racket for your game. We've done over 100 consultations now with a ton of happy customers. I love connecting with you. It's honestly one of the favorite things that I do with TennCom is getting to run these consultations. I spend as much time as I can with all the players. So link in the description. And so when it comes to improving your game, can switching to a new racket help? I think yes, absolutely. Otherwise, why would anyone bother switching away from the first 23-incher? Would it be better to improve your technique, your physicality, or your mentality? Also, yes, that would be way better, but we don't all have space in our lives for that. Where we do have space is in our credit card limit and in the closet of our depressing suburban home. And that is when it's time to use my Tennis Warehouse affiliate link to fill that closet up with new rackets. They're gonna make you play better and they're gonna make you happier.